Welcome to the Fabric Podcast, where we explore company culture and how it scales as a company grows. Brought to you by the team at The Receptionist, a bootstrapped, Denver-based software company. Each episode of Fabric will set out to uncover unique and uncommon answers to the question, how do companies of any size create a culture and core values that employees actually live out? On this episode of the podcast, we're joined by Harry Campbell, a man who has done a lot in his career. From being the VP of a large company to starting an internet startup that, didn't go so well, he has a lot of insight into what makes companies work well. And it all comes down to the people. Not your customers, but rather your team. So Harry's got a lot of great insight into company culture. In fact, he wrote a book about it called Get Real Culture. So we chat about the book, we talk about what's really important for a company, large or small, and if you're a company that's less than, say, 60 people, how that might be a tipping point to culture. Some things to look out for, and how to make sure you maintain company culture that people care about as you scale. So stick around and enjoy this episode. Harry, we are so excited to have you on the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderfully. I have made it through the Thanksgiving week, and I'm ready to rock.
Yes, and I think by the time our listeners are listening to this in the US, we will have gotten through another round of holidays, and it's probably Happy New Year now. So hello at whatever time of year you're listening to us, but I'm glad to hear that your Thanksgiving was well. Awesome. So let's dive in. You have done a lot in your career. So share with us some highlights that have brought you to where you are now.
That makes me feel old, but that's okay.
No, you're experienced. Harry. Tell us about it.
I love that. I've had the fortune of working for some amazing companies and some that other folks wouldn't have ever heard of. I've opened my career spending 7 years in marketing at Procter & Gamble. It's called brand management there, but it is specifically very marketing and strategic driven, and I loved it. I followed that with some time at Sprint. And then in the middle of my career, think about the ages 35 to 40, what I did was I took a right-hand turn. I quit my job as the vice president at Sprint. I became the co-owner of a sports marketing firm. We ended up being an award-winning firm in Kansas City. I loved it. 20 people. Then I sold half of that and became the CEO of an internet startup in Kansas City. And so between the ages of 35 and 40, I completely changed where I was and what I was doing and what I was learning and the platforms and programs by joining these smaller companies. Unfortunately, the internet startup didn't pan out. So I have the failure and humiliation of having to close a company. And then I went back to Sprint after that. And what's fascinating is my career went back to big companies. And I think what I learned between the ages of 35 and 40, working at small businesses and a startup, helped me become a much better leader as I had big jobs later.
Yeah, that's interesting that you sort of ended where you started and that you had some really interesting experiences along the way that informed your next steps.
Yes.
Now, along with all of this, you wrote a book called Get Real Culture. So tell us about how did this come about in all of this busyness and running these companies?
Sure. It's fascinating. I actually have two books, Get Real Leadership and Get Real Culture. In 2011/12, I realized I had I had two things happening. First of all, my wife was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and I decided I wanted to help support her and her cause. And I had some thoughts that I wanted to gather and put down and use for other folks to potentially become better leaders and drive better culture. So in 2012, I wrote a book, Get Real Leadership, followed that up 4 years later with Get Real Culture in 2016. I give 100% of the speaking fees that I get and 100% of the gross speaking fees and 100% of the proceeds from the book go to brain cancer research in support of my wife. I love it. I'm good at it, but more importantly, I use that as a platform to show my wife that I love her and I support her that way. And I'm having a blast doing it.
Oh, I love that, and I feel so sad about that your wife is going through this, but how amazing that has fueled what you're doing and created these products that you can then share with people and give back to her and the cause. So I'm very touched by that. I'm sure many people are when they hear your story.
Sarah, thank you. I'm happy to report that just a few weeks ago, I celebrated a milestone. I went over $400,000 raised for the cause. And by the way, I'm not stopping. I've got book 3 coming out in 2020, and I'm still plowing forward.
Well, that's amazing. Congratulations on all that sort of outward success that helps fuel what you're doing and supporting your wife. That's very, very touching. So let's talk
Thanks.
about the book a little bit more. Obviously, it's doing some great things for people and the cause that you're so passionate about. But you have a premise that a world-class business should focus first on its customers, right? No, start with your team members. So can you share how culture always starts and ends with people?
Sure. Whenever I open up a keynote speech on culture, I talk about 2 premises I have. One of them is it is my fundamental belief that a company cannot win in the medium and long term without a strong culture. I think in the short term, companies can win. They can have a first to market first mover status. They can have a patent. They can have something that enables them to have a differential advantage. But over time, that goes away and it becomes culture. And I fundamentally believe that. I've seen it in operation at small and medium and large companies. The second premise I have is actually a pretty simple one. Culture is all about people. People hire people, people fire people, people follow people, people pay attention and emulate people and or reject them. It is exactly what happens. And therefore, my whole premise on culture comes down to people and success of a company getting a strong culture in the medium and long term.
Got it. So when you say it starts with your team members, what sorts of things might a company do that helps create a positive company culture?
Well, the first thing they do, well, I'll go ahead and give you the 3 that I talk about all the time. Number 1 is treat them like adults. It is an amazing thing that companies kind of talked about as a thing do not think about teaching folks and leaders to treat their employees like adults. That's what fundamentally people want. Second of all, is you need to provide the tools they need to do the job. Notice I didn't say skills. That comes down to hiring and training. I'm talking about the tools to do the job. And third of all is help people feel like they are connected to something bigger than themselves with regard to their job. Those 3 things, treat them like adults, give them the tools, and help them feel like they're connected to something bigger. If you can do all 3 of those, I think you have the opportunity to have a world-class, strong culture.
Yeah. And I think where it often gets lost is number 3 is helping people feel like they're connected. You can treat people like adults. They can have the tools they need, but if they're not connected to something bigger, they're not connected to the other people in the company, you're missing a huge, very critical piece.
Bingo. And I go one step further when I talk about this. Whenever I join a company, I've done this a number of different times. I'm a job hopper. I run different.
You're not alone. I'm sure some of our listeners can very much relate to that.
What I do is I show up and I say, uh, the premise of this company's culture is the customer is always right. And I say, not only no, but heck no, 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 no. The customer's not always right, and it's not customer first. I change the premise and say it's the people first or the team first. And my theory, of which several other senior executives that I've seen have this same theory, including Sam Walton, Richard Branson, and then the QT CEO, who I just heard speak recently, Chet Kadu. They say it is team first. Get the right people in the right jobs with the right tools. They're the ones that take care of customers, and then the results follow. You don't start with the customers, you start with the team. And I love that premise.
Okay, so let's get back to the book. What will readers gain from your book in terms of understanding or learning about culture? Is it what we've just been talking about? And who is this book a good fit for?
I think the 3 pieces that I outlined are very logical, and folks can take that away, and it will matter to them. The fundamental underpinning of all this is that great culture can lead to great business. Even if you have a good strategy, you have good operations, if you don't have a good culture, I just do not believe that you can win in the long term. And I think that's important to take away. And who is this best targeted to? I have spoken to everything from, my son's fifth grade class last year I spoke to.
I love that.
Put that one aside as a separate.
That's an outlier.
It was an outlier. I've spoken to juniors and seniors in high school all the way up to the senior execs from Cisco Systems. The best received group, the group that receives my message best, tends to be aspiring leaders who are earlier on in their career and are still trying to figure out how best to operate, how to treat people, how and when to use positional power, which is rare. You shouldn't if you can help it. How culture can help them win, and how culture can help them get better people working for them, therefore leading to better results.
Got it. So in terms of culture, let's dig into that a little bit more. As we've heard, you've worked with a huge range of companies, Fortune 400 down to the startup just getting started. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen with culture, some of these big companies versus the smaller companies? Are they vastly different?
Sure, Sarah. This is actually a favorite topic of mine. Since I have worked for some of the biggest companies in the world in startups, I was very surprised to find that the culture issues facing these two types of companies are very, very similar. What they do on a daily basis and the bureaucracy and the operating efficiencies, et cetera, of large companies are very different than small. But the people issues, the leadership issues, and the culture issues are the same. And it's because culture is all about people. And what happens is you have a microcosm of it happening in a 20-person company, just as you would in a 1 million employee multinational corporation. How you face them, how you handle them, and how you make your culture great is, in fact, very similar between those sizes companies. And I was surprised at that when I first started working at a small company. I was expecting it to be dramatically different than at a big company. It's not, culture-wise.
I see. So is there anything maybe that is different about in a bigger company, how you, I don't want to say disseminate, but how that culture gets lived out versus in a smaller company? Are there any nuances there, do you think?
That's a very insightful question. Yes, there are. And I would come back to the way I process this is to say big companies' problems usually are around their organizational structure or their operating style, which then leaks into culture. Said another way, they get bureaucratic. They got a lot of people that can say no. They have a lot of meetings and they don't make forward progress. That is not necessarily good. In fact, I would argue it's not good. And little companies don't tend to have that because they don't have the time to do it. And they also don't have the organizational structure in place to do that. Thank goodness. So what happens is big companies then have a culture that starts to get seeped into by those bureaucratic things, and their velocity slows down, their decision making slows down, maybe even their innovation and their want to drive and grow. Little companies don't have that problem. Their problems tend to be more competitive oriented or resource constrained issues where people get upset or they might have problems because they don't have what they need in order to do their job. It's not bureaucracy. It's the opposite of it. It's lack of resources.
I see. So let's talk a little bit more about little companies who are looking to grow and scale. And let's say they've got a solid company culture, but is there a point that you've seen breakdowns happen as companies scale and grow? And the flip side of that is how can a company protect their culture as they scale and grow?
Yes, there's a tipping point somewhere. There's no such thing as an exact number,
right?
But there's a tipping point with regard to culture where it goes from free form, it all works because we're all in this together, and boy, the world's against us, and we got to get out there fast, to more bureaucracy. I have seen this somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 people or so.
Okay.
It gets big enough to where the founder and owner, who, if he or she happens to still be around, is no longer involved in everything. So there are things that she doesn't know about, and they're happening, and they're logically happening, but that's unusual because when there were 12 people, nothing happened without the owner knowing it. And that has an effect on the culture because all of a sudden, if a third of the company is off doing things that are correct strategically and operationally, but they're operating with a different culture, that can start to have issues people-wise and culture-wise. And I think you have to pay attention to that as you get bigger, because the same skill set that it takes to run a business that startup up to 10 people is very different than when you get 60 to 100 people.
Absolutely. So, what do you believe is the most important requirement, if you could pick one, or one of the most important requirements to creating a company culture that employees actually care about?
Um, I'm going to give you an answer you probably aren't expecting. Um, you should expect your people to treat people well. And that means customers, and that means peers, and that means subordinates, that means board of directors members, that means vendors. I always like to say one of the differentiators that I had in my career was that I treat people extraordinarily well. And I don't mean that other folks don't, but it's one of those things that mattered to me deeply.
Right.
I think if you do that and become known for that, it becomes part of your culture. Then what happens is you attract people that like that. You attract people that do that. And the more that you do that, the more quality people want to work for you. And one of the secrets that I always had in my career was great people wanted to work with me. And when they do, I support them and turn them loose and they make me look good. I love that.
Yeah, that's always a good thing. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this insight into company culture, sharing more about what we can expect from your book. If people want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
The simplest thing is to go to my speaking website. It's Harry S. Campbell, S is in Sam in the middle, harryscampbell.com. And I've got some of my speeches out there, some of my testimonials, but also a link to the Amazon site to buy my books in order to support my cause, and some of my travels and other thoughts that are out there. It's kind of a fun little site for me.
Great. Well, we will link that for everyone if they're looking at the blog, and that is harryscampbell.com for any of you listening. Harry, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about culture.
You're welcome, Sarah. I had a blast.
Me too. Thank you. Thank you to Harry for sharing all of that insight into company culture. So much of that is extremely applicable to us here at The Receptionist as we continue to grow and scale into 2021. On behalf of the team here at The Receptionist, thanks for listening to the Fabric Podcast. If you'd like to know more about what we do, go to thereceptionist.com, where you can watch webinars, read blogs, and even sign up for a 14-day free trial. See you on the next episode.